In this lecture, I plan to look at the limits of Hellenization, and that's really a fancy way of saying exactly what happened to this Hellenistic world after Alexander the Great. In the previous lectures, I've discussed the forces of unity. To be sure, the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC determined that the Macedonian Empire would not survive as a political unit, but it did lead in certain developments that promoted a wider unity, a koine culture, as the Greeks would say, a common culture that was given by the administrative and fiscal demands and the social institutions built by Macedonian kings, the founding of Greek cities, changes in economic activity, and even changes in religion, which give a sort of unity to this Hellenistic world, period, or civilization. And scholars are still a bit divided exactly what is Hellenistic. It is Greek-like, not completely Greek, and again, defining it either as a period or a geographic entity is a bit difficult, as well as precisely what elements of Hellenistic civilization mark it as distinctively different from the classical age. What I wish to do is deal with that question and then return to the issue of political unity at the end of this lecture, and how the failure of maintaining that Macedonian Empire in the end condemned the Hellenistic world as it would to conquest by outside forces. These would be the Kushan emperors of Central Asia, the Parthian or Arsacid kings in Iran, and ultimately Rome, which took over the most important areas of the Hellenistic world. All three of these are in effect successors to the Hellenistic world, the people who moved in and took over these institutions and to varying degrees made it their own. Well, the term Hellenistic was coined by the German scholar Johann Gustav Droysen, who wrote in the 19th century, and as I mentioned earlier, wrote very important works on Philip and Alexander the Great, and was one of those German scholars who saw the two Macedonian kings as crucial in state formation. He created the term Hellenistic, Hellenistische in German, to define that world that came after Alexander. It was Greek-like in culture. Its society in many ways resembled the society of classical Greeks, but somehow this civilization differed. It had incorporated Near Eastern foreign elements, and in Droysen's mind, and in the mind of many of the writers of the 19th and early 20th century, Hellenistic carried the sense of being somehow inferior to Hellenic, to Greek, to classical, especially the 5th century BC. This notion was transmitted to students of the various institutions, economic and religious, writing in the 20th century and even down to this day, that the Hellenistic age represents some sort of transition from the pinnacle of the classical world to the Roman Empire. And there's a whole body of classical scholars today who think that Rome is, well, more of a mistake and we really should study Greece. I don't subscribe to that view, and I'm being a bit facetious here. The Greeks themselves, writing in the Roman age, in the 2nd century AD particularly, had the opportunity to look back upon their history and see it in a broad perspective. And I'm sure Droysen was familiar with these passages when he coined that term Hellenistic. There are a number of authors of what we call the Second Sophistic movement. These were Greek authors of the late 1st and 2nd century AD. Plutarch, who wrote the biography of Alexander, Arrian, who wrote the Anabasis, that is the campaigns of Alexander. They would be members of this Second Sophistic. Sophistics, or sophists, as one might recall, were the crucial intellectuals of Athens at the 5th century BC who called into question politics and ethics. They were a very important force in the philosophical and intellectual developments in Athens. Socrates is seen as related or linked to this change in which philosophy turned itself away from cosmology to studying issues such as morality, politics, and human affairs. And the term was coined by these Greek intellectuals to link themselves to the 5th century BC. And that was deliberate. They were going to be the heirs, the intellectual heirs of classical Athens. They wrote in Attic Greek of the 5th century BC. They did not write in the Koine Greek, that is the common Greek. That would be known to people who have studied the New Testament. It's a simplified form of Attic that came into use in the 3rd and 2nd century BC as Greek became the common language of all these non-Greek speakers of the Hellenistic world. Instead, they wrote in the style of Thucydides and the style of Demosthenes, rather than in the actual language of Greek that would have been spoken in the marketplace in the Roman Empire. So in letters, even in arts, visual arts and architecture, these Greek elites postured as the cultural heirs of Athens. They did look back upon the Hellenistic age. They did not see it as dismal as some modern scholars would, as somehow a debased Hellenic culture, as something not quite worthy of the classical. It's significant that they saw that long period as a period defined politically. Pausanias, who was writing in the 2nd century AD, he wrote the Tour Guide to Greece, the Blue Guide to Greece for Roman tourists, in effect. He saw history, Greek history, as a series of hegemonies by Sparta, by Athens, Thebes, and then the Macedonian kings, and finally Rome. In his mind, Greek cultural supremacy was just a given, and that the period of the Macedonian kings it was assumed that Hellenic civilization spread out, but he saw very much that period in political and military terms rather than in cultural and economic terms as modern scholars would. This was echoed by many writers in the Roman age. One of my favorite is Aelius Aristides, who lived from 117 to 181 AD. He's a citizen of both the cities of Pergamon and Smyrna, and as I've mentioned before, he's a hypochondriac who hangs around the Asclepiaeum, the sanctuary of Asclepius outside of Pergamon, the great healing sanctuary, where he writes large numbers of notices about his communication with the god to essentially heal all these imaginary ailments. But he was a brilliant orator, and he too would express Greek history in the terms of Pausanias, and that is the Macedonian kings were hegemons, and they were ultimately promoters of Hellenic culture. And he goes at great length to praise Rome as, in many ways, being the best of hegemons and best of leaders. And of course, he has reasons to do this. He represents the city vis-a-vis Marcus Aurelius on various occasions, if there ever were a Philhellene emperor. These Greeks of the Second Sophistic, however, were also aware of the fact that their culture had changed. That there were many non-Greek speaking peoples, some of them who aspired to literary pretensions. Lucian of Samosata, one of the most delightful writers, writing in the 2nd century AD, wrote a marvelous set of satirical tracts, including all the new gods that had joined Mount Olympus. He was originally an Aramaic speaker. He came from the city of Samosata on the upper Euphrates, and while his Greek is excellent, at times he excuses himself for not being quite as good as he should be because he wasn't a native speaker. There was a great deal of cultural snobbery, in some cases arrogance on the part of the Greek literary circles about the cultures of the subject populations, at least by the Roman age. And therefore, this has led to a reassessment of that Hellenistic world. When you look at the writers of the Second Sophistic and the Greek interpretations of the Hellenistic world, to look at the Hellenistic world in a new light. And that has occurred in the last generation of scholars, again, writing in the aftermath of the Second World War. And they have seen the Hellenistic world and its limitations quite differently from the writers of the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, someone like Droydsen. To them, Alexander's career and the Macedonian kings, whatever their motives, was essentially nothing more than an occupation, as it were a cultural imperialism. Peter Green has argued this most eloquently in his textbook on Alexander the Great. Peter Green is one of the great popular writers of Greek history. His ideas are always interesting. They're certainly controversial. I do not subscribe to many of them, but he always has been able to pose questions that have forced scholars to think through traditional views. Green has argued quite passionately that the Hellenistic kings in Egypt, in the Fertile Crescent, in Iran, in Central Asia, the upper satrapies, were essentially comparable to the French and British in the period between the First and Second World War. He had in mind the European attempt to control the Middle East, the British rule in India. Those were the two periods and places from which he drew his strongest parallels. And he has some information and evidence from the sources to back him up on that. One is the course of the Ptolemaic monarchy, which really went into rapid decline, starting with the 5th Ptolemy, and that was because ultimately the Ptolemaic kings could not maintain the loyalty of their subjects. This occurred in 217 BC, when the Ptolemaic court, and at the time Ptolemy IV was a very young king, the Ptolemaic court, to counter an attack by the Seleucid king Antiochus III, one of the Alexander wannabes, mobilized an enormous phalanx of Egyptians. These were Egyptians to fight as phalangites. The report in Polybius is some either 20 or 30,000 strong, and they won the Battle of Raphia, and as a result, the Egyptians gained the confidence that they could cast out their Macedonian masters. Shortly afterwards, there was a revolt in the Thebaid, that is in Upper Egypt, where revolts always break out in Egypt. And the Ptolemaic kings found themselves with increasing difficulties in ruling the Nile Valley. And in the course of the 2nd century BC, Ptolemaic rule and effectiveness breaks down. By the time the Romans appear on the scene, the Ptolemaic court really controls Alexandria and the Delta. Much of the Nile Valley is, to a large extent, ruled very loosely by the Ptolemies, and this is a reassertion by the Egyptians of their traditional values and cults, and with a sense of independence. There are other indications of this that one could point to. One would be the Iranian populations, which never really were won over to anything Hellenic, were ruled by the early Seleucid kings essentially through their traditional elites. And as archaeology has made clear, there is very little evidence that whatever Iranian religion was at the time that Alexander arrived, that it was ever assimilated to Greek forms. There are really no significant Greek settlements east of the Tigris in the Iranian heartland. Those are all in the distant upper satrapies. And the Iranians, in effect, reasserted themselves by the 2nd century BC, just as the Egyptians attempted to reassert themselves. And Green and other scholars have gone at great lengths to point this out. There have been some extremely significant studies done about other forms of Near Eastern resistance to the Hellenistic rulers. The most remarkable work was done by Samuel Etty, who studies the various religious texts from the Near East between the time of Alexander and the arrival of Rome. These include apocalyptic literature from Judaism, different types of oracles known as the Sibylline oracles, and a whole body of evidence coming from diverse sources that sees the overthrow of the Macedonian kings. One thinks of the images in the book of Daniel. All of this indicating that while the Near Eastern populations probably had been shocked into submission by Alexander's conquest and by the Diadochoi, in the 3rd and certainly by the 2nd century BC, were reasserting themselves in various ways, expressing religious hopes that this order would be overthrown. And Green and others have assembled this evidence and have made an argument that really all that Alexander did was briefly impose a Macedonian occupation over large parts of the Near East, and most of this occupation was destined to fail. It is a very, very challenging thesis. It's a very significant way of looking at the issue. It is, however, in my opinion, overdrawn. In the previous lectures, I pointed out how much impact, to be sure, a lot of it unintended, that these various forces of unity had on transforming the former Persian Empire. This is very much seen in the economic and religious dimensions, where there is a sort of unity. It is also seen in the types of administrative institutions and fiscal institutions built by the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and the Lesser Dynasts across Asia, and even in the Macedonian homeland itself, where the Antigonid kings increasingly made Macedon into at least a Hellenic state in its cultural and institutional forms. Those forces were real, and that when the Romans crossed the Adriatic in 200 BC, they did find a world which, in their mind, was essentially Greek. Greek was the language of administration and high culture. It was the language of international trade, and that to them, everywhere, at least in the western half of the former Empire of Alexander, there was a Greek Koine culture. To be sure, there was enormous diversity, where there was the existence of Egyptians and Phoenicians and others who are hardly assimilated. But what would have impressed the Romans is that this is still essentially some kind of Greek world. And this then gets us to the second issue that I had raised at the start of this lecture, and that is all of these forces of unity, which promoted a cultural koine, an economic unity, but no political unity, that had long-term implications. Scholars have speculated as whether what would have happened if Alexander had not died on June 10th or June 11th of 323 BC. Could he have maintained the empire? Or was the empire destined to split up into its components? That is, the three great monarchies of Macedon, Asia, and Egypt, plus that mess of Greek leads and federations, which was the headache of the king of Macedon to administer. Many would argue that Alexander was fortunate in dying at the age that he did, and he didn't have to face that task. But this is all speculation. We really don't know what would have happened next, what Alexander planned. Those plans attributed to him are simply notes on the Arabian expedition and how to build a monument to Hephaestion. What did happen is at the Battle of Ipsus, the Macedonian Empire was split into these competing states. There was a concert of powers. It had maintained itself from during the 3rd and 2nd century BC. The Seleucid Empire tended to fragment, but fundamentally you're dealing with three great states and the massive lesser cities and leagues. And this political order had a certain cultural unity, and older scholars sometimes looked at the Hellenistic world in many ways as one would look at the Ancien regime of the 18th century before the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, where there was a common European culture, there were a number of dominant powers, none could quite achieve mastery, and Napoleon, of course, would dramatically change all of this by his career in conquest. And the comparison is apt if it's seen in that light. But the lack of political unity, the lack of a single Macedonian state, in the long run that had major implications. And it meant that the world wrought by Alexander, that the ultimate heirs to his traditions were not going to be Macedonians and Greeks. They would be others who would appear on the scene on the fringes of the Hellenistic world and conquer sections of that world and make it their own. There were three separate peoples who fell heirs to part of that Hellenistic world and civilization. And let's deal with them from east to west rather than chronologically. In the upper satrapies and even in the Indian conquests, I mentioned in several of the lectures that a very distinct Greco-Bactrian civilization emerged. These were the cities of Bactria and Sogdiana, the various Alexandrias that had been established back in 329, 327 BC. Greek kings ruled here. They were the descendants of Euthydemus, who had taken over probably around 230 BC, and ruled down to close to 190 BC. The dates of these kings is rather uncertain, and we know a great deal of information largely by the magnificent portrait coins they issued, which were perfectly Greek in inspiration and carried the traditional divinities of Greek and are some of the finest portraits of any Hellenistic monarchs that we have. Euthydemus and his successors built upon the caravan routes of Central Asia. They exploited the silk trade that came into centers such as Marikonda and Bactra, the principal city of Bactria. They also extended their conquest back into the upper Indus Valley, the land of the five rivers, and briefly the upper Ganges. Somewhere around 190 BC, Demetrius, one of these Greco-Bactrian kings, crossed the Hindu Kush and essentially repeated the conquest of Alexander. He penetrated deep into the Ganges Valley and established a Greek presence in northwest India. And what happened is that essentially cadet branches of the Greco-Bactrian family back in Central Asia ruled in the Indus and the upper Ganges. The most famous is the Greek king Menander, who is known in Buddhist sources as a wise man. And Buddhist traditions assure us that he had converted to Buddhism. It's by no means certain that's true, or whether he was just a very good patron of Buddhist shrines. His coins seem to indicate that he favored a number of different gods, Greek as well as native. But in any event, this part of the Hellenistic world ultimately fell to peoples of Central Asia. The Bactrian kingdom itself was overrun by Iranian nomads by 130 BC. They're known as Sakai. Cities such as Khanum, the excavation on the near the Oxus River, which may have been in Alexandria on the Oxus. That city was destroyed and not reoccupied. The Greco-Indian kingdoms lasted a bit longer, and ultimately Central Asia and the Indian possessions, that part of Alexander's empire, was united by a people from Central Asia, later known as the Kushans. Descendants of a Tocharian-speaking people, that is a Indo-European language in Central Asia, known in the Chinese sources as the Yue Qi, and their emperors of the 1st and 2nd century AD built up a remarkable state in northern India and Central Asia. The Greek elements in this state were very few. Some of it can be detected in the art of Gandhara, that is of today essentially Pakistan and part of Afghanistan, where Buddhist artistic traditions do show certain Greek influences. But beyond that, the Hellenistic world really didn't go much beyond 130 BC when the Greco-Bactrian kingdom collapsed. And so the Greek kings of Bactria were essentially isolated from the rest of the Hellenistic world, and their demise was determined by far greater events in Central Asia and India. In the Iranian heartland there, a region which the Seleucid kings ruled largely by courtesy of the Iranian elites. I mentioned that Seleucus I and Antiochus I were popular because of their Iranian connections. Seleucus had married Apame or Apamea, the daughter of Spitamenes, and therefore Antiochus himself was half Iranian in descent. But as time went on, the Seleucid state, which was essentially a Hellenistic kingdom, depending on the resources of its Greek population, removed its capital to Syria, to Antioch. There was a subsidiary capital in Babylon. They had a residence at Sardis, and no power. And the Arabs were to discover the same in the 7th century and 8th century AD. No power can rule Iran without being in Iran. It is just too great a country, too large a population, with too many great traditions. And ultimately what happened is that Iranian speakers from the steppes, known as the Parthians, and their family are known as the Arsacid kings, moved into Iran in the mid-3rd century BC and steadily overran the Seleucid Empire in the east. There were several very embarrassing defeats. In 129 BC, the Parthian king Mithridates I defeated and captured the Seleucid king Demetrius II. That defeat was seen as a turning point. Actually, Demetrius was held as a hostage for a number of years and then was released to cause more disorder in the Seleucid state. And by the death of Phraates III in 57 BC, these Parthian kings had essentially united Mesopotamia, that is Babylonia, the Iranian heartland, and parts of Central Asia into a new Parthian empire. The Parthian kings styled themselves as Phil-Hellenes. In the Seleucid capitals, Babylonia, they encouraged their Greek population, who continued to engage in trade, but they also encouraged the Aramaic-speaking populations, the Sogdians of Central Asia, who had communities throughout the Parthian Empire in the trade. They were, in many ways, heirs to the great king of Persia. They had many useful subjects. And while in part they styled themselves as Phil-Hellene, they really were fundamentally Iranian rulers. And in 227 AD, they would be overthrown by a new dynasty, Sassanid Shahs, who would rule even more decidedly as Iranian rulers under a reorganized faith of Zoroastrianism, and that would be a great resurgence of Iranian traditions. And so in the central parts of Alexander's empire, that is the Iranian heartland, the Hellenic influence in the end proved ephemeral, just as it done in Central Asia. And instead, Iranian traditions reasserted themselves steadily under the Parthian and then under the Persian Shahs. The final newcomers, and in some ways they were the earliest, chronologically, and to some extent we're moving in reverse, were the Romans. At the time of Alexander's death, there were reports that Alexander had plans to conquer the Western Mediterranean. This inspired all sorts of speculation. There was actually a fictitious embassy invented in later sources that the Romans showed up and warned Alexander, you don't come to Italy. This is all part of the Roman self-image and typical of the way the Romans had very ambiguous attitudes to Alexander, which I'll pick up in the last lecture. In any event, the Romans, in some ways, turned out to be the least obvious of Alexander's heirs, and in many ways the most successful, and in a way the institutional heirs of Alexander in the Hellenistic world. And this is because of the peculiar institutions of Rome, which really would have perplexed both Macedonian kings and Greek citizens of Greek city-states. For one, in the Western Mediterranean at the time of Alexander's death, the city that would have been most congenial to Greeks and to Alexander would have been Carthage. It was a Punic city established by Tyre, a great city by all accounts. It had a cosmopolitan population. Part of the population was speaking Greek. Carthage had long been in association with the Greek world and assimilated Greek cults. In fact, Aristotle paid the highest compliment to Carthage, writing in his Politics what we know about the Carthaginian constitution. To him, Carthage, while not Greek-speaking, was a polis. It had a constitution. It governed itself by the rule of law. And it's one of those remarkable cases that a Socrates would like, that Hellene is more than just an ethnic or racial definition. It had something to do with the way you governed yourself. And many Greeks would find Carthage quite congenial in Alexander's time and well into the 2nd century BC, whereas Rome was a rather drab and unimpressive Italian town. But what the Romans had were the means to conquer and to rule that Hellenistic world and make it their own. Rome is a peculiar state. It is certainly in this period of its expansion what is contemporary with the Hellenistic world, perplexing to the Greeks. Polybius had to write a whole history explaining Roman success. But what the Romans had were three advantages. First, they had long been in contact with Greek civilization through various intermediaries, Etruscans, the Greeks of Italy and Sicily, and finally the Greeks themselves as they crossed the Adriatic in 200 BC. And the Romans were able to come to terms with Greek civilization on their own terms, and adapt it and take on what they want. You can see this in letters. You can see this in philosophy and a whole. They were deeply influenced by Greek letters, but wrote in Latin and made Latin a language at least, if not on par with Greek, certainly very close to it as a great literary language. No other people had been able to do this in the ancient world. Now, if you wrote anything about on any subject in the Hellenistic world, you always wrote in Greek. The Romans, therefore, had this peculiar relationship with Greek civilization. They respected it. They understood it. They also understood the notions of constitutions and city-states. And that gets to the other two Roman advantages. Rome, in the way she governed herself, made sense to the Greeks. It was a city-state. It had many of the qualities of a city-state. Of course, it wasn't a democracy. The Romans never came close to democracy. Nonetheless, it was a well-ordered republic, and someone like Polybius, a Greek writing in the 2nd century BC, could describe the Roman constitution in Greek terms. Now, he missed a lot of important points, and his description of the Roman constitution has problems, just as Montesquieu doesn't know what he's talking about to a large extent on the British Constitution. Nonetheless, Greeks could see Rome as an allied city and not as an oppressive monarchy, the way the Macedonian kings were. And that made a very significant difference and gave the Romans a great advantage when they intervened and conquered the western half of Alexander's empire, which became their east. The final advantage that the Romans had, yes, they governed themselves as a city-state, and they had all the patriotic sense of a city-state. Its nobility was geared to war, trained to lead citizens in battle. In many ways, they shared the ethos of their counterparts in the Greek world and even with the Carthaginians. But one thing Rome had that no city-state ever had is it had the military might of a bureaucratic empire. It could summon legions of citizens, Latin allies, Italian allies, on an order that only a great kingdom in the Near East could do. And this is because of the peculiar Roman political institutions. And so Rome appeared to the Greeks as a city-state, but it had the might of Macedonian kings. In fact, it had the might of armies that would have won the admiration of Alexander. And that heady combination of city-state institutions and patriotism with the military power of a great monarchy and a respect for Greek civilization gave the Romans the means to conquer rapidly the core of the Hellenistic world and turn it into their own eastern provinces, and so lay the foundations for the Roman Empire, clearly and without doubt the most successful and perhaps the most important of the ancient empires of the Mediterranean world.